Sam Goodman, bringing you another episode of really fucking scary stories. How are things going in your creepy, crawly neck of the woods? Things are going great here. I'm coming to you from the beautiful and the sunny downtown Phoenix, Arizona, here in the Pale Horse Media Co-Studios. Do me a favor, head on over to www.palehorsemedia.co for more episodes of really fucking scary stories and episodes from our other great podcasts, such as The Hop Nerd, Hey Y'all with Sam Goodman. There's also a merch store. There's all kinds of great stuff happening over at palehorsemedia.co. Thank you once again for joining us today. Today we are going to jump into a great creepy crawly tale. We're going to talk about the Fox Sisters, the amazing Fox Sisters, the unlikely founders of spiritualism, aka necromancers to the dead. So let's start right here and let's talk about a little thing called necromancy. So necromancy is the practice of magic involving communication with the dead. This is accomplished either by summoning their spirits as apparitions, visions, or raising them bodily. Necromancy is mentioned all the way back into the Bible and even somewhat before. What most of us are pretty familiar with as far as necromancy goes is kind of that image of a seance, right? Of folks kind of hanging out in a room, turning out the lights, and then all of a sudden stuff starts moving, bells start jingling, there's big boom, knocks like that on the table, and just all kinds of crazy shit starts going down. And then the spirit, the person, your dearly departed, is channeled through the necromancer in some form of wild communication in which they can communicate with you and others in the room. It's sometimes referred to as magic of the dead or dead magic. It's a form of witchcraft or black magic in which people communicate with the dead, right? That's kind of the whole point here. They're trying to communicate with those that have crossed over. They're trying to establish some means of communication or summon apparitions through all kinds of wacky and wonderful and weird ritual. So in the early to Middle Ages, many medieval writers or thought leaders believed that actual resurrection could not be accomplished by man, could not be accomplished by a person, that it required the assistance of God. They saw the practice of necromancy as really at the root of it just being the conjuring of demons who took the appearance of spirits. So the practice explicitly became known as Malfeasance in the Catholic Church, and they condemned it. Medieval necromancy is believed to be a synthesis of astral magic derived from Arabic influences that kind of got mixed up with exorcism that's obviously derived from Christianity and Jewish teachings. Arabic influences are evident in the rituals that involve the moon phases, sun placement, day and time. The act of burying images are also found in both astral magic and necromancy. Christian and Jewish influence appear in the symbols and in the conjuration formulas used in the summoning ritual. So it was pretty wacky, but even though it was condemned by the church, practitioners were often members of the Christian clergy. So there was some non-clerical practitioners that were out there, but at the time, a good portion of them were clergy. They were members of the church. So the Catholic Church was like, no good. Nah, bro, you can't raise the dead. And the necromancers were like, way, like we can raise the dead. And they're like, no, bro. And they're like, way, we totally can. And necromancy continues on into even kind of the more modern day here, right? And there's been a fair share of doubt around it. There's been a fair share of folks that have been ousted as frauds, that have been caught with strings tied to their toes that are tied to bells to make stuff jingle. Just you name it. There's like tons and tons and tons of examples of fraud. I was listening to something the other day talk about kind of the uprising of necromancy and that it occurs around times of great tragedy, right? So you see times around like the plague, and there's this gigantic uptick in necromancers. You see stuff in a more modern era around 9/11, right? So around that horrible event of September 11th, where you see this kind of almost more modern form of necromancy emerge. That's stuff like ghost shows, right? You see folks, I've got one sitting here. I've got an SC7 or an SB7 spirit box sitting here next to me that we use on some of our haunted road trips, right? So let's just say something like, you're cruising through the channels, you go across like Travel Channel, and then all of a sudden there you see Zach Bagans, right? You see the Ghost Adventures crew, and they're going ham on some crazy motel or something, right? And it's really a form of necromancy, right? It's them trying to bridge the gap and trying to communicate with the dead in some form or fashion. I just found that super interesting. So, again, hashtag fun fact, that you see a massive rise in these things. It kind of shoots through the roof around tragedy, and then as we kind of move away from tragedy, necromancy kind of fades out, and then boom, tragedy, and then it's back. And that makes complete and total sense, right? There's a massive tragedy, massive loss of life. There's a lot of folks that are confused and down and depressed and just covered in grief, and they would like to speak with the folks that in tragic situations are often taken from them way too soon and without any form of proper goodbye. So folks are trying to find a way to speak with those family members, those loved ones, the dearly departed. Now all of a sudden, here comes the necromancer. Hey, I can help you out with that. I can help you out with that. So it's something that's been going on for a really long time, continues to this day, in more kind of, there's some story of kind of normal, kind of that old school necromancer, but most of what you see it on television, right? You see it on here or there. You see it out on the street here in Phoenix. There's some folks that you can go and, let's just say, practice some magic with, and they will connect you with your loved ones, right? So just a really interesting phenomena in general. So what we're talking about today, though, it's the Fox sisters. Some of the most famous necromancers of all time. And as we mentioned at the beginning, they are credited as being the founders of spiritualism, right? So they were credited as being kind of like, hey, these folks kind of got this whole thing really going. Spiritualism is a lot of what it sounds like, and necromancers, spiritualism, intertwined, connected, right? So it was really in a religious movement. It wasn't really organized. It wasn't anything like what we think of like a church. So it was kind of informal, but it was based on the beliefs that the spirit of the dead exist and that they have the ability to, and the inclination to communicate with the living. Like they want to communicate with the living and they have the ability to do so. So the afterlife or the spirit world is seen by spiritualists not as a static place, but as one in which basically spirits continue to live, continue to evolve. So they believe that contact with spirits is possible, and that more advanced or blessed or gifted humans could actually communicate with them. So a really interesting kind of hashtag fun fact here as well, is that spiritualism, and let me back up. So spiritualism flourished for about a half of a century. So there was lots of camps, meetings. They kind of all got together and started chatting a little bit. But this is the fun fact, is that many, if not most prominent spiritualists were women. So there's those causes kind of around this time, such as the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, that a lot of these folks that were spiritualists were leading this, which is kind of interesting, right? They were involved in these activities. They supported those causes. And then obviously over time, spiritualism kind of lost its credibility for, maybe some obvious reasons. I don't know. I'll let you be the judge of spiritualism. It is not my job to judge here. My job is to bring you the really fucking scary bits. And so there was some spiritualist churches forms. There was some offshoots, I guess some denominations, if you will, of spiritualism. But the Fox sisters were a huge part of this. So whether you're a skeptic or a believer, you can't ignore the phenomenon, right? You have to see spiritualism for what it is. It was a big deal, and it was going on like a shit ton. The origins of America's first spiritualist movement started pretty humbly and started in New York, just a few miles outside of the Erie Canal town of Newark, about 20 miles west of Rochester. I have not spent like any time in New York, so I can't tell you much of anything about what New York's lay of the land is. So, but during the winter of 1847 to 1848, 15-year-old Maggie Fox and her little sister Katie, who was 11 and a half at the time, schemed to frighten their mother, Margaret Fox, by creating sounds that echoed through their farmhouse at night. At first, the girls tied strings to apples, then repeatedly dropped them on the stairs to mimic ghostly footsteps. According to an interview that Maggie gave to New York World 40 years later, she and Katie soon learned to make popping, cracking, and thumping sounds on their own. So while the exact method that they used is never really fully explained, Maggie claimed that they did so by popping and cracking their knuckles of their fingers, their toes, snapping their big and second toes together. So that's a pretty interesting thing. Maybe I need to learn to snap my toes. Like, you're just grooving along with the song, not snapping your fingers, just snapping your toes. I might get some funny looks. But eventually the girls became so adept that they performed the trick in their stocking feet, even while standing in shoes. So they've got on stockings, they've got on shoes, and they're still snapping their toes, and it sounds like it's right there. So that's pretty loud. Like, if you're popping your toes that loud. Let's just say early on that it's pretty apparent that the Fox sisters have some, pretty mad skills going on here. Whether it's, later on, we'll kind of dig into that, but let's just say that they've got a gift for being pranksters, that they are quite good at it. So as has continued, so Mrs. Fox super duper superstitious. So she basically became convinced that their farmhouse was haunted. In contrast to her husband John, who was a blacksmith, scoffed at all this, just insisting that the sounds came from a loose board or there was a shutter that rattled in the night. All the stuff that I tell myself too, when things go bump in the night in the house, there's all those creaky, kind of scary sounds, right? So Maggie later claimed that she and Katie planned a final performance for their mother in which they would talk to the ghost. After the rapping sounds had begun in the evening on March 31st, 1848, Mrs. Fox rose from her slumber, lit a candle, and began searching the house. When she reached her daughter's bed, Katie peered into the darkness and boldly addressed the ghost. "Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do," she said, snapping her fingers in the cadence of the earlier noises. The appropriate raps followed. Maggie then clapped her hands 4 times and commanded that the ghost clap back. The ghost going to clap back. 4 knocks followed. As if on cue, Katie responded by making soundless finger-snapping gestures that in turn were answered by some rappity-tappity-tap. Taking pity upon her terrified mother, Katie then offered a hint of explanation for the sounds. "Oh, Mother, I know what it is. Tomorrow's April Fool's Day, and it's somebody trying to fool us," she began. But Mrs. Fox apparently refused to consider the suggestion of a prank. The ghost, she believed, was real, and terrified though as she was, decided to test it herself. Initially, she asked the ghost to count to 10, and it responded appropriately. She asked other questions, the number of children she had, etc., etc. All the numbers were correct. As for, she asked their ages. Again, anything where it's like, "Hey, ghost, 2 plus 2 is what?" Right, so it's kind of all that stuff. She's hitting the nail on the head, and it's scaring the shit out of her. The domestic drama might have ended there had Maggie and Katie failed to respond, but Mrs. Fox's reaction took them aback. To confess what they had begun as a prank had evolved into a cruel joke was unthinkable. So it's kind of like, you can't just be like, "Hey, Mom, guess what? I know we've been fucking with you for 6 months. I know that you're to the point of being scared shitless. You're to the point of calling in the priest. It's not good. And now you've been asking it questions and it's been responding. By the way, it was just us. It was just us, right?" So it would not work that well. So they thought that would just be absolutely unthinkable, that it would, incite their parents' wrath. So basically, after an awkward pause, the spirit rapped out its agreement to talk to the neighbors as well. So the first to arrive was Mary Redfield, initially skeptical, but she found answers to be accurate as well, and she quickly scurried off, up the road to tell more neighbors, right? Just "Hey, everybody, come take a look." So the next night, there was a curious crowd of neighbors, everybody in the neighborhood's "This house is fucking haunted. There's a ghost in this motherfucker. Let's check this out." The spirit began its rappings. Frustrated by the clumsiness of the communication, one visitor proposed a code. He assigned numbers to letters of the alphabet so the ghost could not only spell out words, but whole sentences. So later on,